folks. Welcome aboard here to the Sports Talk Nation. Michael Cohen here with you. We got a very special guest coming up in a moment in Mr. Rick Laughland. Well, the landscape of the NBA. We haven't done a lot of NBA videos, and especially from the New York standpoint for a good reason, because for really the better part of the last few years, and really almost the last decade, with the exception of a couple years here and there, basketball in the NBA for New York has been nothing spectacular, nothing to write home about, pretty much unmemorable, with the exception of, a week with Jeremy Lin, doing things with the Knicks, and, of course, Jason Kidd coming back to coach the Nets for a year. Other than that, it has been a lot to write home about when it comes to the NBA in this town. That is now all changing, and all changing because a couple of big-time All-Stars have decided to come to New York, not to the Knicks, but to the Brooklyn Nets. And that's going to change the landscape of this franchise. It's going to change the landscape of the entire NBA with Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving coming to New York. So, Rick, I want to welcome you into the program. Of course, Rick Laughland, the editor of Amazing Clubhouse and also the Jets 24/7 page, all through CBS.com. And, Rick, I know you're a big Nets fan. This is just a game changer. If it works out for the Nets, it's just a game changer in so many ways.
And, Michael, for myself, a longtime Nets fan, and the other 6 Net fans that are out there, you're right. This really has the opportunity to transform this franchise. Going back to that move from New Jersey to Brooklyn, and I know, again, being a lifelong New Jersey resident, difficult transition, letting the hometown team basically cross over that state border into Brooklyn with of course, Mikhail Prokhorov, the infamous trade that went down with the Boston Celtics and under former general manager Billy King's watch to allow those unprotected first-round picks go, and bringing in a Paul Pierce, Kevin Garnett, and at the time Jason Terry, all outstanding players in their prime. The unfortunate thing for the Nets was they were way too long in the tooth, and the Nets basically mortgaged their future for an opportunity to compete with, at the time, was the Miami Heat, led by LeBron James, Dwayne Wade, and Chris Bosh. And that was a trade that, when you look back now, what Sean Marks, the current GM, inherited, and for him to make in these 4 short years, that kind of turnaround, a team that won 17 games just a couple seasons ago, to now landing 2 of the marquee free agents on the market, it's just nothing short of extraordinary. I mean, again, being a lifelong Net fan, I've seen some good, I've seen a lot of ugly, and of course going back to the Jason Kidd years, the trade that Rod Thorne made, and even there were interviews this week with Rod Thorne, who, bringing in Vince Carter via trade, bringing Jason Kidd, which was up until this point the biggest move in franchise history, and depending, again, the big question mark is going to be the health of Kevin Durant. But this has the opportunity to usurp Jason Kidd trade as the biggest moment in Nets franchise history. But health is going to be a major concern. And the story that really, if you're a Net fan, Kyrie Irving being a lifelong New Jersey resident, playing locally at the high school at St. Pat's, he had been a Net fan really since 4th grade, watching that Jason Kidd back-to-back finals teams. And for him to come back home, so to speak, and play for the team that he grew up rooting for. I mean, if you're a Net fan, that's all you could ask for. But you just have to hope that for Kevin Durant, there's not really a strong track record of players suffering Achilles tendon injuries and coming back to being the same player. But if any medical staff can get Kevin Durant back to 100%, it would be the Nets and the doctors that they have on staff in the organization.
Well, I'll be honest with you. I mean, I never thought that we would see these two guys come to New York, let alone come to the Brooklyn Nets. Mainly, especially from the standpoint of Durant. Now, the backstory is tremendous, and you touched on it in a minute. And before we ever knew what was really going on behind the scenes, or had an idea of what may have been going on behind the scenes, you think about where these guys would want to play. They would want to play somewhere where they, one, have a really good chance to win, 2, where there may not be as much pressure, media pressure, to win right away. You come to New York, you're going to be, and you're a big time star. You're asking to be thrown right into the heater. It doesn't matter if they're playing for the Knicks or for the Nets. You're going to get roasted one way or the other. So I thought, for someone like a Kevin Durant, maybe he would be better off staying in Golden State. There was a lot of talk about maybe that he would rather stay out west because maybe he's a little bit too soft for the New York media. Those questions again, are going to get answered in the next couple of years when he comes back from the Achilles tendon injury. But what's really behind all of this, as you mentioned, is Kyrie Irving and his desire to come here, wanting to come here. And, think about this. How many people have wanted to come play for the Nets? Darren Williams was traded here from Utah. He really never really wanted to be here. Jason Kidd, even though he spent a better portion of his prime years here in New Jersey, there was always talk about how unhappy he was here, that he would always, he wanted to go to San Antonio, and he was talking about signing his deal with the Spurs, ultimately came back to the Nets. So even with all the superstars they've had, they really haven't had anybody really say, I want to come play for the Nets. For Kyrie Irving to do that, it's just like mind-boggling and so rare for someone to do that this was part of his plan deep in his heart for many, many years, that he wanted to come here and play for this organization. So that says a lot about him. Now, there's been a lot of talk about his personality in the locker room in Boston, and that it didn't rub off well with a lot of young players there. I thought it was very revealing in this, I guess it was a one-on-one that they did, Brian Lewis's article in the New York Post with Kyrie Irving, where he says that there was players who were partying during a back-to-back, and then they got killed after that back-to-back, and that was part of the impetus for Irving to kind of lash out on his teammates. The culture, from what I've seen with Brooklyn, a little bit more controlled than what we're hearing about with Boston. Maybe the persona, the idea that Kyrie Irving is some kind of bad teammate, going back to his days with the Cleveland Cavaliers, wanting to be the guy instead over LeBron James and causing some friction there. Maybe he has matured. Maybe he is going to be that leader that this team needs, that this team thought it had in D'Angelo Russell, but now gets it in a more established all-star here in Irving.
And Michael, again, being a longtime Nets fan, and I of course followed them from New Jersey to Brooklyn. There were a whole host of issues, and you mentioned Jason Kidd being unhappy, of course, him having a fallout at the end of his time in New Jersey. Vince Carter, of course, they said when he was traded ultimately to the Orlando Magic, he was jumping for joy. He was so happy to be out of a Nets uniform and back in a contention, and at that point, the Nets were in a full rebuild mode. But nonetheless, the Nets were never considered a marquee franchise. Nobody wanted to come to play in a half-empty building in the middle of the swamp. The franchise made a difficult decision that they were going to make the move to Brooklyn, and I know a lot of New Jerseyans weren't happy about it. But again, they have really created a culture now. And when Sean Marks took over, the Nets were completely depleted of draft picks. He actually had to purchase draft picks just to even build up the draft stock and try to find some young talent. And these are the type of moves that the Nets and Net fans especially can appreciate for a franchise that was really in the doldrums the past few years. And I want to get to your point about Kyrie Irving because, Kyrie had mentioned about being in Boston, and, from what I read and what I gathered from his comments, he simply didn't like living in Boston. He had been a New York, New Jersey guy for his whole life, of course, was spent time with LeBron in Cleveland, and he was on a mission following that loss to Golden State in the finals a couple of years ago. He was on a mission to prove that he could be the guy. He was always the Robin to LeBron as Batman, and he wanted his own team and to be able to essentially lead a team to and maybe possibly win a finals. And I think he quickly realized, he made some comments too, because there was some infighting with LeBron, that he took some of LeBron's leadership the wrong way, that he felt that, LeBron was maybe a little unfairly critical of him. But now that he stepped in that leadership role, you mentioned with some of those Celtics players maybe partying on back-to-backs, not doing the right thing, I think he understood where LeBron was coming from. So I think Kyrie has kind of recognized that he can certainly be the focal point of the team. There will be nights where he can carry a team. He can be one of the leaders on the team. But it was pretty evident during his time in Boston that he cannot be the guy. But the reason that Kyrie was here is because Spencer Dinwiddie is very close with him. He became a key recruiter in bringing Kyrie into a Nets uniform. And reportedly, even though Karis LeVert is very close to Durant, they trained during the offseason, this was the perfect culmination of events. You the right place at the right time with a GM that just basically turned the team on its head and turned a disastrous situation into one of the most enviable now across the whole NBA.
Well, and now the next thing they have to do is to make sure it works. And like you mentioned before, they have a lot of good young pieces in Spencer and Dinwiddie, Karis LeVert, Jarrett Allen. They have a lot of good core pieces. And you look at this situation now for the Nets moving forward, they're not going to leapfrog as one of the favorites in this conference. It sounds like Kawhi Leonard, who was MVP of the NBA Finals with the Toronto Raptors. It sounds like he's going to go west to the Lakers. So you're going to have a situation where the Atlantic Division is going to be wide open. You're going to have, the Celtics are going to take a step back without Kyrie there. The Raptors are taking a step back without Kawhi Leonard there. So the Nets now are the forefront of their division, and really in the forefront right there with Milwaukee for the tops in the Eastern Conference. So there's going to be a lot of pressure now on this team to not just win, but to win a championship right away. There's going to be pressure now on Kenny Atkinson as the head coach in this situation to get all these good pieces to work. And then when you get to next year, what's the situation going to be with Kevin Durant? Coming back from an Achilles tendon injury, it's not an easy injury, especially in the NBA to come back from. And, at his age, 30, he's going to be 32 when he comes back. The doctors have said, and it's been published, that for any NBA player to expect to be fully 100% back to where he was in year one, it doesn't happen. It usually takes a couple of years. So at one point, what kind of impact is he going to have on this team? Is it going to be 80% of what we've seen from Kevin Durant in the past? Is it going to be 75%? Is it going to be 50%? If it's 50%, the Nets are in trouble. So that's going to be a big question for them moving forward. They put all their poker chips to the front of the table, and we'll see if it works for them. It's a huge gamble. If it pays off, if they win an NBA title in the next 2 to 3 years, it was all worth it. If not, then it's going to be one of those moments in New York sports that's just going to be looked upon as another big failure for a New York City team.
Well, and look, I think the Nets are hedging the bets on the fact that they have the best training staff across the NBA. I mean, they built an absolutely unbelievable practice facility. They left no stone unturned as far as trying to get players proper treatment, to give them an opportunity to recover after injuries. I saw Karis LeVert at the beginning of the year suffer a horrific injury. When it first happened, it had shades of Gordon Hayward. It looked like a Paul Millsap type of injury that not only was season-threatening at the time, they were led to believe it could be career-threatening. And of course, it ended up being a dislocation of his foot, which is a heck of a lot better than a compound fracture or anything of that nature. But the Nets training staff was really instrumental in getting Karis LeVert back in time for the playoffs. I mean, he played at the end of the year. He averaged over 20 points per game against the Philadelphia 76ers. And you flash back just 3 or 4 months, and people didn't think that there was fear that he would never return to the court. So I have been just blown away at how this training staff has gotten the most out of its players as far as the strength and conditioning is concerned, as far as recovery and getting back from serious injuries. I understand that this is a huge risk. I think the Nets understand that. Their team doctors, they have the affiliation with Hospital for Special Surgery. The doctor that performed the surgery on Durant is the Nets team doctor. And, for that to be the case, he's obviously following him from the procedure all the way through the recovery process. They're not going to take any chances. If there's any chance of re-injury or Durant's not 100%, they're not going to bring him back. But I wouldn't discount the possibility the Nets are, in a first-round series, or let's say they advance, that Kevin Durant would try to make a comeback when the Nets are making a playoff push next year. But again, they're a long way off from that.
Yeah. Let me just jump really quickly over here to the other coin here, other side of the coin, that's with the New York Knicks. And, of course, all the Knicks fans were up in arms when this news came down on Sunday, that this was a complete disaster and that, how could this happen? The aura of the Garden is gone. The aura of the Knicks is gone. I heard Stephen A. Smith talking about this is the worst moment in the history of basketball. I mean, this is how Knicks fans have been reacting the last couple of days. My question to this is, when in the last 20 years has there been any aura around Madison Square Garden and the Knicks? That's my question to a lot of Knicks fans. Where's that aura been for the last 20 years? I mean, the last time that I can remember there being any kind of real mystique aura around the Knicks was, 1999, 2000? I mean, we're talking about the days of Allen Houston and Latrell Sprewell and Larry Johnson. It's been that long ago since the Knicks have mattered. Other than a one playoff series where they got smacked around by the Nets, when they had the Knicks had Stephon Marbury, and then with the exception of the 3 weeks where Jeremy Lin was tearing it up in February of 2011, 2012. Other than that, there hasn't been a whole heck of a lot to write about with the Knicks, other than just absolute misery. We go from Isaiah Thomas to what we have now. And to me, the reason why you don't see a Kevin Durant or a Kyrie Irving or a Kawhi Leonard or any of these guys going to New York, and of course, even 10 years ago with LeBron James going to New York, two words: it's James Dolan. It's the culture that has the culture of stink that's enveloped the Knicks for far too long. That's been the big problem. Now they have an opportunity with some young players, guys like R.J. Barrett, Kevin Knox. They have an opportunity with some young players to let these guys play and see what they can do in the next year. But it's going to be a full rebuilding process, which is what the Knicks should have done a long time ago.
You hit the nail on the head. It goes back to ownership. You look at James Dolan over the past 2.5 decades. The bright moments for the Knicks have been few and far between, and it trickles down from ownership on down. James Dolan, again, that arena, just because of that aura that people think exists, it sells out game in and game out, whether the team, like this past season, is winning 17, 18 games or they're in the playoffs. It doesn't seem to matter, and you just have an owner that it seems like it's the definition of insanity, doing the same thing over and over again and expecting the same results. And look, I think that Steve Mills, I think he's made some good decisions with the Knicks. He's got them headed at least in the right direction, established a little bit of a better culture. But again, I really, all along, I felt that Kevin Durant, the two choices was going to be go back to the Warriors or take a chance and go with Kyrie to the Nets. And ultimately, again, he picked the latter. But Knicks fans needed to understand that the culture is just not there with the Knicks. I've seen firsthand with the Nets how terrible their culture was for many years. They were basically, as a franchise overall, they've been nomadic. Now that they're ingrained at Barclays Center, that's their long-term home now, and they had a general manager that basically cut out all the BS, so to speak, and built this team from the ground up. And, yeah, they had to endure some really lean seasons 3 years prior to this, but they built the thing the right way. And I think for the Knicks, it just, for me, James Dolan, you talk about even, how he's treated his former players and Charles Oakley, banning him from the Garden, has a fan that basically questions Jim Dolan as the owner, and he bans him from going to any Knicks games. You have a hypersensitive owner that, of course, is really what I would call a trust fund baby that has probably never worked a day in his life and is more concerned about his guitar playing and touring the country, playing at different music stops, but more vested in that than he is in the Knicks or Rangers combined. It just is a recipe for dysfunction and disaster. Whether you go to the Phil Jackson hiring or Isaiah Thomas, none of these things have panned out, and it seems to me it's almost like the Woody Johnson syndrome, where you want them to own the team, you want him to have deep pockets and reinvest in a lot of different ways, but you want him to have a hands-off approach and let the basketball people make the basketball decisions. And just like Woody Johnson, I don't feel like he does that. And more times than not, it comes back to bite them in the rear end. Yeah,
you're absolutely right. He meddles in way too much. He's more involved with the Knicks than he is the Rangers. The Rangers, he's hands off. The Knicks, it's been a complete disaster. It's like a lot like what we see with Woody Johnson and even Chris Johnson, for that matter, with the Jets. The Wilpons with the Mets. You have these owners who just meddle in everything, and they try to even be, in some ways, de facto GMs when they really know next to nothing about the sport in which they are running the team, and as a result, it just becomes a complete and utter mess. This is an opportunity now for the Knicks and for James Dolan to back off a little bit, let these young kids play, see what you got. Maybe you can develop something. Maybe you can do something what the Nets have done with some of their young players and actually develop somebody. Maybe develop a couple of stars yourself. Maybe R.J. Barrett becomes something big here in New York, and you go from there. They have to look at this and say, hey, look, let's just develop our players. Maybe we get some stars out of this, and if we do that in a couple of years, that's what will attract the big names to come. That's what happened here with the Nets. You got to attract the stars to come here because you have stars in play, and you have a culture that wants to win, and that's what the Knicks do not have.
I remember even that press conference going back a couple of months, which was the season wrap-up, and you had James Dolan at a press conference in front of reporters basically reading off a roster sheet. He didn't even know the players that were on his team at that point. That's how disconnected, and as you mentioned, he tries to make basketball decisions, and he just has no clue of what he's doing. And the fact that, again, you're only as good as the people you surround yourself with, but he doesn't seem to have that trust factor. I think that, again, his father, of course, was heavily involved with the Knicks, and he seems to have some kind of emotional investment in the Knicks doing well. And it's not so much with the Rangers, whether it's not his first love, whether he grew up loving basketball, I'm not so sure, but you would think that we learn a little bit of something about the fact that the further away he gets from the Rangers, the more success they tend to have, and that probably would be the same case with the Knicks if he could show a little bit of restraint and a little bit of humility and maybe check his ego at the door and just allow this thing to grow organically, which is exactly what the Nets did. I mean, ownership and Mikhail Prokhorov has actually learned his lesson by basically now adopting a hands-off approach. He saw exactly what happened when he tried to meddle in affairs and try to basically build a winner overnight. It had a major blowback effect, and now that he's been a little less visible as far as being in the media, a little less visible as far as making demands as far as trades are concerned, and not meddle in affairs as an owner of the team.
Rick Laughland, of course, again, folks, from 24/7 Sports. Rick, always a pleasure to have you on, man. And it's good to get some NBA talk in for the first time in a while.
Yeah, Michael, anytime. And like I said, as a Nets fan, I'm pinching myself at the idea of having Kyrie Irving and Durant potentially in Nets uniforms, if not at the end of this year, the end of next year, because I couldn't have in my wildest dreams imagined that'd be the case when they were the New Jersey Nets and playing at Prudential Center with Devils logos on the back of the seats. It was just they've come a long way in 5 or 6 short years.
They have. They really have. All right, Rick, talk to you next time, man. All right, folks, thank you all for tuning in and listening. Remember to like and subscribe right here to the Sports Talk Nation on YouTube. Remember to follow us on Facebook, facebook.com/OpenMicProgram, and on Twitter @OpenMicNJ. Have a great 4th of July weekend, and we'll talk to you next time.